Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world where dust doesn't mean you need to find a feather duster, but rather that you're at the height of fashion. Imagine walking into a Georgian drawing room in the late 1700s. The air isn't crisp or cliff is hazy, thick, and glittering with a constant snowfall of white powder. You breathe in, and your throat feels just a little dry, as if someone spilled a sack of flour nearby. And the strange part is everyone in the room is thrilled about it. The men look like ghosts, with rosy cheeks painted on, their wigs puffed into frosted mountains. The women's gowns shimmer faintly with powder that has clung where it shouldn't. It's as if the entire social elite has willingly transformed into living pastries. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive this scene, not because of political intrigue, but because after 5 minutes of powder in your lungs, you'd be sneezing yourself right out of polite society. Yet for Georgian gentlemen, this was not just decoration, it was expectation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you don't mind, post your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where and when you're listening in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk further into the powdered haze, noticing how the chandeliers reflect tiny motes drifting down like snow. This isn't an accident. For Georgian high society, powder wasn't just for hair, it was a symbol. Gentlemen and ladies dusted themselves, their wigs, and sometimes even their clothing with fine white starch powder. It made them appear clean, pale, and aristocratic. Historical fact: starch mills were big business in London and Paris, churning out the stuff by the ton. So much so that entire neighborhoods smelled faintly of scorched wheat. But here's the quirky part. Sometimes that powder wasn't only wheat starch. Recipes existed that included ground bone, crushed shells, or even chalk dust to get just the right shade of ghostly white. Think of it like a centuries-old version of choosing your makeup palette. And because people back then weren't big on bathing daily, a heavy dusting of perfumed powder doubled as deodorant. If you walked past a well-powdered Georgian gentleman, you might get a whiff of lavender or roses, or, depending on the batch, something that smelled closer to burnt toast. Historians still argue whether the obsession with powder started more as a necessity than a trend. Some claim it began with the need to control lice in wigs. Others argue it was about hiding greasy hair in an age when shampoo didn't exist. And still others say it was purely aesthetic, a way to look aristocratically pale, signaling that you never had to labor in the sun. Whatever the reason, by the mid-1700s, powder wasn't optional. It was fashion law. As you settle into a high-backed chair in that powdered salon, you notice something odd. Your clothes are now lightly dusted too. Just from sitting, powder didn't politely stay where you'd put it. It floated, it clung. Servants had to sweep constantly, dusting furniture, brushing coats, and wiping mirrors that collected white streaks from the constant fallout. Georgian households were essentially in a permanent snowstorm that never melted. One London visitor described a gentleman entering a room, removing his hat, and releasing such a cloud of powder from his wig that everyone nearby had to blink it away. That's the reality of these powdered men. They didn't just look powdered, they shed powder wherever they went, like dandruff, but much more expensive. And of course, the powder became a language of its own. A thickly powdered wig meant you were wealthy, in the know, and properly refined. Too little powder, and people might whisper that you couldn't afford enough. Too much, and you risked looking ridiculous, the Georgian equivalent of using half a bottle of hair gel. But in those hazy salons, surrounded by candles, mirrors, and perfume, there was a kind of dreamlike beauty to it all. The longer you sit in that Georgian drawing room, the more you realize that this whole powdered performance is not just about fashion, it's about ritual. You watch a gentleman excuse himself, step toward a corner table, and begin his careful preparation routine. He produces a wig stand, yes, like a little mannequin head, then pulls off his wig with a flourish, as if he's undressing a very delicate pet. The hair beneath is short, cropped close to the scalp, which was practical, because wigs weren't meant to sit on wild, untrimmed hair. Then comes the powder. He dips a wooden puff, something like an oversized makeup brush, into a tin of fine starch, and with a patient hand, he dabs it across the wig's curls. A cloud rises with every tap. If you lean closer, you smell roses mixed with something faintly scorched, like bread left in the oven too long. Powdering was messy business. It clung to your eyelashes, it tickled your nose, and it got into your tea if you weren't careful. But it was considered essential. Historical fact: in 1795, Britain even placed a tax on hair powder. The government saw how universally popular it was and decided to cash in. Overnight, powdered wigs and powdered hair became symbols not just of fashion, but of financial loyalty to the crown. Paying the powder tax marked you as someone invested in the system. Dodging it, that could earn you a reputation as either stingy or radical. Here's the quirky tidbit: some men went to extraordinary lengths to avoid paying that tax. Records mention fellows disguising their starch powder as flour for baking, or claiming it was medicine, or even accidentally spilling it on the floor if a tax inspector happened by. So yes, imagine hiding your hair care products the way someone today might hide a questionable internet search history. Historians still argue whether the powder tax is what finally killed the fashion, or whether it was already dying out by the time the tax came along. Some point to the French Revolution, when the powdered elite became literal targets, as proof that the look was politically doomed. Others say hygiene concerns, shortages of wheat, and the rise of simpler styles just made the whole thing impractical. But while it lasted, powdering remained a daily choreography, a performance of identity. You notice how it spreads beyond just wigs. The cuffs of gentlemen's coats glimmer faintly with dust. The collars of their cravats whitened from an absent-minded pat of a powdered hand. And shoes, even buckled leather shoes, sometimes bore powder, dropped like careless frosting. The effect wasn't neat. It was never meant to be neat. Instead, it created this dreamy, softened atmosphere, where everyone seemed lit from within by a faint chalky glow. Of course, the mess extended beyond the drawing room. Picture a Georgian gentleman strolling down a busy London street. Every gust of wind carried away some of his carefully applied powder, scattering it into the air, where it mingled with horse manure, chimney soot, and the general aromas of 18th century city life. There are satirical sketches from the time showing powdered men sneezing so violently that their wigs flew off, leaving them bald and ridiculous. It was comedy fuel, especially for the working classes who couldn't afford such extravagance. And then there's the sound. You can hear it now. The soft tap-tap-tap of puff against wig, the whisper of powder falling onto polished wood floors, the faint squeak of a servant's brush as they frantically try to keep up with the endless dusting. It's strangely soothing, like white noise before white noise machines existed. Sitting there, you almost forget that this isn't just vanity. Powder was a tool of disguise. It made age less visible. It hid thinning hair. It blurred the greasy reality of unwashed scalps. And in some cases, it covered up diseases. Syphilis, for example, often caused patchy hair loss, and a powdered wig could conveniently disguise the evidence. In that sense, Georgian powdering was both costume and camouflage, equal parts elegance and survival strategy. As you glance around the powdered haze of the salon, one thing becomes clear. This was a society obsessed with appearances, willing to endure sneezing fits, flowery furniture, and powder taxes, all in the name of looking just right. And as you settle deeper into your chair, dust settling softly on your own sleeves, you realize it wasn't just hair. They powdered everything. The longer you linger in that room, the more you start to notice that the powder doesn't stay politely confined to wigs and scalps. It drifts, it clings, it settles on surfaces and fabrics, as if trying to colonize the entire Georgian world. A gentleman leans forward to reach for a cup of chocolate, and a soft puff of powder drifts from his sleeve into the drink. He doesn't even flinch. This, after all, is just part of breakfast. Powder wasn't just hair care. It was decor, seasoning, and sometimes even an uninvited guest at the table. The mainstream fact: many gentlemen and ladies extended powdering beyond their wigs to their faces and clothing. A pale complexion was still considered a marker of refinement, so powdered cheeks, even powdered hands, were thought to look elegant. Powdered gloves were a small status symbol. It was less about cleanliness and more about broadcasting. I don't labor outdoors, and I can afford to sit here glowing like a marble bust. The quirky tidbit: not everyone agreed with this aesthetic. There are satirical letters complaining about powder snowstorms at the theater, where an audience member sitting behind a gentleman might get showered in starchy flakes every time he adjusted his wig. One even joked that powdered men should be charged rent for the space their cloud occupied. Imagine buying a front row seat only to spend the performance sneezing into your handkerchief. Historians still argue whether this broad powdering of garments and skin was deliberately fashionable or merely the side effect of enthusiastic wig care. Was a dusted shoulder a chic accessory, or simply proof that you had a clumsy valet? Some portraits suggest intentional frosted garments, while other records imply it was more of a tolerated nuisance than a style choice. The scene around you blurs, powder clinging to the flickering candlelight, turning the air into a haze. A gentleman adjusts his cravat, leaving chalky fingerprints across the pristine linen. His companion, trying to appear nonchalant, discreetly pats powder onto his eyebrows, giving himself an odd, ghostly look. Even the furniture seems complicit. Chairs develop a thin frosting across their carved wooden backs, like forgotten pastries in a cold bakery. You try not to laugh when you notice one tiny absurdity. Someone's spaniel trots proudly across the carpet, its ears powdered white, not from a fashion statement, but because it wandered too close to the wig stand. Georgian dogs, apparently, had no escape, and yet, for all its ridiculousness, there's something strangely serene about the whole atmosphere. Powder mutes sharp edges, blurs imperfections, and softens the world into a chalk-dusted dreamscape. If today's Instagram filters could be bottled as starch and brushed onto wigs, this is exactly what it would look like. Still, practical concerns were never far away. Powder was expensive, and applying it required time and skill. Servants were tasked with shaking and puffing, often holding cones or masks over their masters' faces to protect eyes and lungs during the process. These masks, called powder masks, looked oddly modern, like cloth respirators, and they were meant to keep people from inhaling clouds of floury dust. Of course, nobody worried much about what happened to the servants doing the shaking. The sound of this daily ritual was unmistakable. The rustle of wig stands being set up, the soft thuds of powder puffs, the faint coughs of those caught downwind. If you close your eyes, it's almost like a lullaby, the Georgian version of a white noise machine. And beneath it all, the obsession with powdered elegance never really fooled anyone about the inconvenience. Even Georgian writers noted how powder seemed to invade every corner of life, slipping into soup, into bedsheets, onto letters. Powder wasn't just fashion, it was environmental. You lean back in your seat, noticing how your own cuffs have begun to whiten just from sitting near powdered company. Maybe it's absurd, maybe it's overdone, but in this powdered haze, you start to understand why Georgian gentlemen couldn't stop. Once you dust one thing, you might as well dust everything. And in this soft, chalky light, even the ridiculous feels strangely dignified. The powder obsession didn't stop at wigs, faces, and sleeves. It crept deeper into the daily rituals of Georgian life. By now, you notice that entire rooms seemed engineered to handle the business of powdering. Wealthy homes often had a dedicated powder room, not the polite bathroom euphemism we use today, but literally a chamber where you could stand, sit, or spin while servants dusted you with clouds of scented starch. These rooms sometimes had tiled floors or washable walls to make cleanup easier, because the fallout wasn't subtle. It was like living inside a bakery gone rogue. The mainstream fact here is simple. By the mid-18th century, powdering had become so widespread among the elite that specialized architecture was designed to accommodate it. Whole households adapted their schedules and furniture around the ritual. You weren't just a gentleman with a wig, you were practically a one-man snow globe in need of careful maintenance. Now, for the quirky tidbit, there were devices called powdering machines or powdering closets, where a gentleman or lady would place their head through an opening, and servants would puff powder through a bellows contraption, coating the wig without turning the rest of the room into a winter wonderland. One diarist complained the process made him feel like a pig roasting on a spit, which is an image you can't really unsee. These contraptions were ingenious, but also faintly ridiculous, like the 18th century cousin of sticking your head under a hairdryer dome at the salon. Historians still argue whether these powder rooms and gadgets were primarily about hygiene, keeping the rest of the house less dusty, or more about spectacle. Was it practical architecture, or was it another way for wealthy families to flaunt how much powder they could afford to waste? The debate lingers in part because few powder rooms survive intact. Much of what we know comes from satirical sketches and cranky household records. Standing inside one, though, you can imagine the atmosphere. A chair sits squarely in the center. A valet holds a puff the size of a sofa cushion. The air carries the mingled scent of lavender, orris root, and plain old flower, depending on the household's budget. You hear faint sneezes from the servant, tasked with shaking, because protective masks were often forgotten or powder clings to the candle flames, giving the light a ghostly halo. There's also an irony here. The same ingredient used to thicken sauces or bake bread was being lavishly poured over wigs in homes where servants often struggled with food scarcity. Powder wasn't just about fashion, it was about class. You were dusting your hair with what others desperately needed for supper. A cynical part of you wonders if the gentlemen ever thought about that, as they sat in their powder rooms surrounded by little storms of flour. Still, the comedy of the setup is undeniable. Imagine walking through corridors after a long evening, leaving faint, chalky footprints like a mischievous phantom. Imagine opening your diary only to find powder flakes stuck between the pages, so your deepest secrets are sandwiched in starch. Even beds weren't safe. Many noted how powder rubbed off on pillows, meaning you could wake up looking like you'd face-planted in a bakery. And yet, there was something strangely comforting about the ubiquity of it. Powder softened hard furniture. Lines dulled the sharp smells of crowded city rooms, and blurred imperfections the way fog makes everything look mysterious. Even when inconvenient, it must have given life a hazy, dreamlike filter, like living inside an oil painting that refuses to come into focus. Sitting there, you start to think of the powder as a character in its own right, fickle, messy, slightly comic, but also strangely loyal. Wherever a Georgian gentleman went, the powder followed. On his sleeve, in his carriage, clinging to the rim of his glass, powder was not only fashion, but also companionship, an invisible pet that never left his side. And so you exhale, letting yourself sink into the quiet absurdity. Powdered men, powdered rooms, powdered everything. The whole world a little softer, a little blurrier, a little sillier, and somehow, in the drifting haze, a little sleepier too.